Dean Morrow's fist caught Raymond Calloway across the jaw before the old man could finish his sentence. Ray hit the kitchen floor hard, his coffee mug shattering beside him, hot liquid spreading across the boards. He was 78 years old. 2 wars, 3 Purple Hearts, and he refused to sign. "Last chance, old man," Morrow said, crouching down, voice low and flat. "Write your name on that paper, or we take what we want anyway." Ray looked up through blood and said nothing. Outside, headlights were already cutting through the Montana snow. Before we go any further, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments below. We want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that Montana night and everything that led to this moment. The town of Coldwater Ridge, Montana, didn't have much to offer the outside world, and Raymond Calloway had always preferred it that way. He had come home from his second tour with sand still in his boots and a wife waiting on the porch. And for 47 years, that porch had been enough. The Calloway homestead stretched 200 acres from the Ridge Road down to the lower valley, and every one of those acres had cost something. Sweat, blood, time. His wife Eleanor had walked every fence line with him in the early years, marking corners, reading the land the way other women read letters. She had died 3 springs ago under the oak at the eastern fence, the one she had planted from a seedling carried from her mother's yard in Georgia. Ray hadn't moved the tree. He hadn't moved anything. He was standing at the kitchen counter, pouring his second cup of coffee, when the headlights swept across the window. He didn't move right away. Men who had been in combat learned to measure threats before reacting. The headlights stayed. 2 vehicles. He heard doors open and close. 4, maybe 5 of them. He set his mug down carefully, crossed to the window, and looked out into the dark. 3 men were walking toward his door. He knew Dean Morrow by reputation before he knew him by face. Harlow's man. The one who had shown up at Ed Briggs's place last winter and left with a contract Ed didn't remember signing. Morrow was broad and heavy through the shoulders, the kind of man who used his size as a first argument. The 2 with him were younger. The one on the left had the jittery energy of someone who had done this before and liked it. Ray had the door open before they knocked. "Mr. Calloway," Morrow said, stopping at the bottom of the steps. "Appreciate you being up." "I didn't know I had a choice," Ray said. Morrow smiled with half his mouth. "Mr. Harlow sent us to close out that offer. The deadline passed 2 weeks ago, but he's willing to honor the number. He's a generous man." "He's a thief," Ray said, "and so are you. Get off my land." The smile dropped. Morrow reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. $240,000, Mr. Calloway. That's a fair price for land in this county." "It's not about the price," Ray said. "It never was." "Then what's it about?" Ray looked at him steadily. "My wife is buried on this property. My grandfather built the barn with his own hands. My son grew up running that field. You tell Victor Harlow that if he wants this land, he'll have to carry me off it in a box. Now I told you to get off my property." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Morrow nodded once, slowly, and said, "All right." He stepped up onto the porch, and Ray barely had time to register what was happening before Morrow's shoulder drove into his chest and sent him backward through the door. Ray hit the kitchen floor. The coffee mug went with him, shattering. A hand grabbed his collar and yanked him sideways. He tried to get his arm under himself. Morrow crouched over him, close enough that Ray could smell cigarettes and cold air on his jacket. "Sign the paper," Morrow said quietly, "or we take the night to remind you why old men shouldn't live alone." Ray looked up at him. His ribs were screaming. His jaw felt like it had been hit with a board. And he looked at Dean Morrow and said, "No." Morrow hit him again. The younger one, Tyler Hooks, was already moving through the kitchen toward the back of the house. The third man, Brock Nash, stood by the door, watching the road. Ray heard drawers being yanked open, furniture being shoved. They were looking for something. He knew exactly what. The deed. The original 1897 land grant establishing the Callaway property in Glacier County. The one document that could unravel every permit Victor Harlow had filed. The one thing Ray had never let out of his possession. "Where is it?" Morrow called from the back bedroom. Ray said nothing. He pulled himself against a kitchen cabinet, one hand pressed to his ribs, and listened to them tear the house apart. He heard the trunk being dragged across the floor. He heard the closet door hit the wall. He heard Tyler say, "It's not here," and Morrow respond, "Then we keep looking." Ray's phone was on the counter above him. He reached up slowly, fingers closing around it. He found the number. He pressed call. It rang twice. A voice came through, familiar and tired, the way a man sounds at the end of a long shift. "Dad? It's late." "Jake," Ray said, keeping his voice low and level. "Come home." A pause. "What happened?" "Just come home, son." He heard his son's breathing change on the other end. In the background, soft panting. Then Jake's voice came back, different now, sharpened down to something precise and cold. "I'm 40 minutes out. Don't hang up." "They're in the house," Ray said. Another pause. Then, "I know. I'm coming." Ray set the phone on the floor beside him, screen down, call still open. He pressed his back against the cabinet and breathed through the pain and waited. A younger man might have panicked. Ray Callaway had stood in a rice paddy in 1968 with 3 men down and a radio that wouldn't transmit. And he had waited then, too. Waiting wasn't surrender. Waiting was strategy. Morrow came back into the kitchen. He looked at Ray on the floor, then at the counter, then back at Ray. "Where's your phone?" "I dropped it," Ray said. Morrow scanned the floor. He didn't see it. He crossed to the counter, swept a row of jars onto the floor. Then he stopped and turned. "The deed. Tell me where it is and we walk out of here and none of this happened." Ray looked at him for a long moment. "My wife left a note before she died," Ray said. His voice was completely steady. "She said, 'Raymond, one day they'll come for this land.' She said, 'Make sure someone is standing here when they do.'" Morrow stepped closer. "That's real touching. Where is the deed?" "Someone is standing here," Ray said. Morrow hit him a third time. Ray went sideways onto the floor and stayed there, one arm under his head, breathing shallow. He heard Morrow moving toward Tyler. He heard low voices. He heard Nash say something about headlights on the Ridge Road. Then he heard the engine, sharp, high-pitched. Not a truck, not Harlow's people. The engine of a police cruiser pushing hard up a frozen mountain road. Nash stepped back from the door. "Dean?" "I hear it," Morrow said. He looked at Ray. His jaw tightened. "This doesn't end tonight. Whatever your boy does with his badge, Harlow's lawyers will have it buried by morning." He grabbed his jacket from the chair. "Tyler, Nash, let's go." He walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. He looked back at Ray on the floor. "The land isn't worth dying for," Morrow said. Ray met his eyes. "That's how I know you've never had anything worth keeping." Morrow left. Ray lay on the kitchen floor, ribs burning, one eye swelling shut. And he listened to the cruiser slide to a stop on the gravel outside. He heard the vehicle door open, then a second sound, lower and closer to the ground. claws on frozen gravel, then on the porch steps. Then a pause at the doorframe, a single controlled whine. Then his son's voice. "Dad." Jake Calloway stood in the doorway, 25 years old, uniform dusty from a 14-hour shift, badge on his chest, dark brown hair pushed back. Beside him, pressed tight against his leg, was Rex, 4 years old, German Shepherd, tan and gold coat with a black saddle that caught the kitchen light. His eyes moved from the broken mug to the scattered jars, to the open drawers, to Ray on the floor. And they stayed there. Rex crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. He lowered his head and pressed his nose gently against Ray's hand. Ray breathed out slowly. He reached up and put his palm on the dog's head. Jake was already on one knee beside him, hand on his shoulder, eyes reading every cut and bruise with the systematic focus of a man trained to assess damage quickly. "How many?" Jake said. "3, Ray said. "Morrow and 2 of his." Jake looked at his father's face. Something moved behind his eyes, quiet and very dangerous. "Did they find what they were looking for?" Jake asked. Ray shook his head slowly. Then he reached up and took his son's face in both scarred hands, the way he used to when Jake was 5 years old, and said very quietly, "They were looking for the deed, son. Don't let them find it first." Jake held his father's gaze for a long moment. Rex pressed closer, warm and solid against Ray's side. Outside, the Montana wind moved through the valley. The oak tree at the eastern fence stood in the dark, the same as it always had. And somewhere down the ridge road, 3 sets of taillights were disappearing into the snow. They would be back. All 3 men in that room understood that without saying it. But so would Jake. The ambulance left the homestead at 11:47 p.m. Jake watched the taillights disappear down the ridge road, and then stood in the cold for a long moment without moving. Rex sat beside him, close enough that Jake could feel the warmth of the dog's shoulder against his knee. Neither of them went inside right away. The kitchen smelled like broken coffee and old fear, and Jake wasn't ready to walk back into that yet. He filed the report from the hood of his cruiser, every detail. Morrow's name, Tyler Hooks, Brock Nash, the folded document, the broken mug, his father's jaw. He logged the call time, the arrival time, the direction the vehicles had gone. He photographed the door frame, the scattered drawers, the shattered glass. He did everything right. He had been trained to do everything right. He submitted the report at 12:31 a.m. and drove to the hospital. Ray was sitting up in the bed when Jake came in, jaw swollen, 2 cracked ribs taped, a bandage above his left eye. He looked like a man who had been in a fight and won on points, even though he'd taken the worst of it. The nurse had told Jake on the way in that his father had refused painkillers twice. "You didn't have to do that," Jake said, pulling the chair close. "Do what? Refuse the pain medication?" Ray looked at him. "I wanted to think clearly." Jake set his hands on his knees. "Dad, I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning. Every conversation you've had with Harlow's people, every offer, every visit, all of it." Ray told him. It took 40 minutes, 3 visits over 6 months, 2 letters from Harlow's attorney, a meeting with Pruitt, their county sheriff, who had sat across from Ray in the diner and told him, man to man, that refusing the offer was going to make his life complicated. When Ray described that meeting, something settled in Jake's face that didn't move for the rest of the conversation. He drove back to the homestead at 2 a.m. He didn't sleep. By morning, he had pulled every public record he could access on Victor Harlow's land acquisitions in Glacier County. 4 properties. 2 sold under what looked like duress. 1, fire, ruled accidental, Structure destroyed. Owner relocated within 3 weeks. 1. Drowning. Ed Briggs, 61. Found in the Marias River in November. Ruled accidental. No investigation requested by the county. Jake stared at Ed Briggs's name for a long time. He drove to the sheriff's department at 8 a.m. with his report and a list of follow-up requests. Pruitt kept him waiting for 25 minutes. When he finally came out, he didn't invite Jake into his office. He stood in the hallway with his coffee and read the report standing up. And the expression on his face when he handed it back was the expression of a man who already knew what it said. "I'll look into it," Pruitt said. "Sir, Morrow's name is on 2 prior complaints in this county. The connection to Harlow is documented. This isn't a property dispute. This is assault and criminal intimidation, and possibly part of a pattern going back to—" "I said I'll look into it, Calloway." Jake looked at him. "My father's 78 years old, with 2 cracked ribs." Pruitt met his eyes without blinking. "And I'm sorry about that. I said I'll look into it." Jake drove back to the homestead. Rex paced the back seat the whole way, reading something in Jake's posture that Jake hadn't put into words yet. 3 days passed. No arrest warrants. No follow-up calls from the department. Jake checked the case status twice and was told both times it was under review. On the 3rd night, Rex woke him. It wasn't barking. It was the low, locked sound Rex made when something was wrong but not yet immediate. The sound that meant the dog had already made his assessment and was waiting for Jake to catch up. Jake was out of the cruiser with his flashlight before his boots were fully laced. Rex led him to the barn door in 15 seconds flat. Tyler Hooks was crouched against the far wall with a red fuel canister in one hand. The second canister was already open at his feet. He hadn't heard Jake come in because Rex hadn't made a sound on the way. For 1 second, all 3 of them were completely still. Then Rex was moving, and Tyler Hooks was not fast enough. Jake had him cuffed in the snow before the man stopped struggling. Rex sat 3 feet away, ears forward, breathing steady. Jake called it in. Pruitt arrived himself. That was the first thing Jake noticed. The county sheriff, personally, at 2 a.m., for what should have been a patrol deputy call. He walked the scene. He looked at the canister. He read Jake's field notes. Then he walked Tyler Hooks to his own vehicle. Jake stepped forward. "What are you doing?" "Taking him in for questioning." "I already read him his rights. The arrest report is filed." Pruitt looked at him over the roof of the vehicle. "There's a question about proper search procedure on the barn entry. His attorney is going to challenge it." "Rex detected an accelerant. That's probable cause." "That's a conversation for the DA's office." Pruitt opened the door. "I'll handle it from here, Calloway." Jake stood in the cold and watched Pruitt's vehicle leave. He knew before the taillights cleared the ridge what was going to happen. He had known from the hallway outside Pruitt's office. He just hadn't wanted to say it out loud yet. Tyler Hooks was released on a procedural technicality by 6 a.m. Jake sat at his father's kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee and Rex at his feet, and stared at the empty chair where Ray should have been sitting. His father was still at his cousin's place in town. Jake had insisted. Ray had argued for 20 minutes and then gone, which meant he understood the argument, even if he wouldn't admit it. Jake pulled out his notebook. He wrote 2 columns: what he could prove, what he suspected. The second column was longer. He was still writing when he noticed the loose board. He hadn't been sitting at that end of the table. He had gone to the window and come back, and Rex had followed him, and then stopped, nose down, at the base of the old army trunk in the corner. Rex wasn't alerting. He was just interested. Dogs notice things through smell that humans walked past for decades. Jake moved the trunk. The board underneath was slightly raised on one edge. He worked his fingers under it. It came up without resistance, like it had been opened before, recently. Inside was a waterproof envelope, sealed with 2 layers of tape, pressed flat against the subfloor. Jake sat back on his heels and held it in both hands for a moment before he opened it. The original 1897 Callaway land grant was inside, hand-signed, county-sealed, completely intact. Beneath it, folded carefully, was a hand-drawn map on yellowed paper. Property lines, survey markers, a river tributary running through the lower eastern quarter of the land, marked in red ink. Along the margin, in handwriting Jake recognized from birthday cards and grocery lists and notes left on the refrigerator door for 30 years, were 6 words. They will lie about the river. He read it twice. The handwriting was Eleanor Callaway's, his mother's. He turned the paper over. Nothing on the back. He looked at the survey lines again, at the red tributary, at the careful hand that had marked it. His mother had died 3 years ago. She had marked this map before she died. She had sealed it under that floor and told no one except Ray. And Ray had said nothing until the night 3 men came to the house and put him on the ground. Jake sat on the floor of his father's kitchen with the map in his hands and felt something shift in the center of his chest. Not grief, not anger. Something older than both. The particular weight of understanding that the people who love you are sometimes braver than you know. He drove to the hospital. Ray was already awake, sitting up, watching the window. Jake set the envelope on the blanket without speaking. Ray looked at it for a long moment. When he looked up, his eyes were full in a way Jake hadn't seen since the funeral. She found it 6 months before she died, Ray said. She was out walking the east fence, the way she did every spring. She said the survey flags were wrong, said they'd been moved. She spent 3 weeks in the county records office. Then she came home one night and sat down at the table and said, "Raymond, somebody's been planning this for a long time." Jake looked at the map. The tributary. Federal waterway, protected under the Clean Water Act. Harlow's pipeline crosses directly through it. Ray paused. Your mother said the permits had to have been filed with false survey data. She said if someone looked at the original 1897 grant against the current county filings, the discrepancy would be obvious. Jake said quietly, "That's a federal crime." "That's why she hid it," Ray said. "She said, if I take this to the county, it disappears." She wanted to wait until we had someone we could trust. Jake looked at his father. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Ray was quiet for a moment. "Because I wanted to believe it wouldn't come to this. I wanted to believe a man could just say no and be left alone." He looked down at his hands. "I was wrong about that." Jake stood. He folded the map carefully and put it back in the envelope. "I'm going to need a journalist," he said. Ray looked at him. "You sure about that?" Jake was already at the door. Rex was on his feet. "Mom left us a map, Dad. The least we can do is follow it." He walked out into the Montana morning and didn't look back. Sam Briggs drove a 2009 Subaru with a cracked windshield and a press badge that had expired 6 months ago, and Jake almost didn't call him. He stood at the kitchen counter for 10 minutes with the phone in his hand and the envelope on the table before Rex walked over and sat on his foot. Jake looked down at the dog. Rex looked back. Jake dialed. Briggs picked up on the second ring. "I know who you are," Briggs said before Jake could speak. "I've been following your father's situation for 3 months. I just didn't have a source willing to go on record." Jake said, "I have documents." A pause. "What kind of documents?" "The kind that turn a real estate dispute into a federal case." Another pause, longer this time. How soon can I be there? How far are you? Bozeman. 4 hours, Jake said. Come after dark. He hung up and stood there. Rex pushed his head against Jake's thigh. Jake reached down and ran his hand along the dog's back. That automatic motion that had become something close to prayer over 4 years of working together. He wasn't sure yet if calling Briggs was the right move. He was sure that the right move inside the system had already been closed off, and a man without options stopped caring about which door he used. He drove to the department at 9 a.m. to file a follow-up on the Tyler Hooks release. Pruitt's secretary told him the sheriff was unavailable. Jake waited 40 minutes. Pruitt never came out. Deputy Angela Flores caught Jake's eye from across the room and gave him a small, careful shake of her head. Just enough. Jake read it. He nodded once and left. He was halfway to the parking lot when his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. The voice on the other end was smooth and unhurried. The voice of a man who was accustomed to being listened to. Officer Calloway, my name is Victor Harlow. I think it's time you and I had a direct conversation. Jake kept walking. I'm listening. I want you to understand that what happened at your father's property was not authorized by me. Dean Morrow exceeded his instructions significantly. I've already addressed that internally. 3 cracked ribs and a concussion, Jake said. That's what Morrow's instructions produced. I understand your anger. I do. And I want to make this right. I'm prepared to increase the offer to $320,000 and to include a full medical settlement for your father's injuries. No litigation, clean and done. Jake stopped walking. You're calling me to negotiate. I'm calling you because you're a reasonable man, and I think we can resolve this without any further unpleasantness. Jake looked at the sky for a moment. Mr. Harlow, my mother is buried on that land. My grandfather built the barn on that land. And the pipeline you want to run through the eastern quarter crosses a federally protected waterway, which means every permit you've filed with the county was submitted on false survey data. He let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. You're not calling me because I'm reasonable. You're calling me because you're scared. The line was quiet. Then Harlow said, very evenly, Be careful, son. I'm not your son, Jake said, and hung up. He sat in his cruiser with the engine off and his hands on the wheel. Rex watched him from the back seat. The call changed the timeline. If Harlow knew enough to call directly, he knew about the envelope, which meant someone had told him, which meant someone who knew about the envelope had talked. The only people who knew were Jake and his father. Jake's jaw tightened. He started the engine and drove. Ray was at his cousin Martha's house in town, a small blue house on the west side of Coldwater Ridge. Jake knocked. Martha answered, concern already written across her face before he said a word. Ray was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea he wasn't drinking. He looked better than the hospital, but not good. The bruising had settled into colors that made Jake's chest hurt. Jake sat down and put the phone on the table between them. Harlow called me this morning. Ray's expression didn't change much, but his hands tightened around the mug. What did he say? He made a new offer. Then he threatened me. Not with words, but the kind of thing you understand without the words. Jake leaned forward. Dad, who else knows about the envelope? Ray was quiet for a moment. Martha knows there's a document. I didn't tell her what it contained. Jake looked across the table at his aunt. She raised both hands. I haven't spoken to anyone. Jake nodded. He believed her. He sat back. The call could have come from a different direction. Harlow had money and connections, and a man like that didn't wait to be surprised. He probably had ears in the county records office, maybe in the hospital. The nurse who had checked Ray in. The deputy who had taken Jake's initial report. Any one of a dozen people. It didn't matter who. What mattered was that the window was closing. He was back at the homestead by noon when his radio crackled, and Pruitt's voice came through with 3 words that stopped him cold. "Calloway, my office." He drove in. Pruitt was standing at his desk this time, not the hallway. The door closed behind Jake. Pruitt didn't sit. "I'm suspending you pending a use of force review," Pruitt said. "The Tyler Hooks incident." His attorney filed a formal complaint this morning, claiming your canine caused injury without sufficient probable cause. Jake looked at him. "Rex detected an accelerant. 2 open fuel canisters. I had every legal right." "That'll be determined by the review board. In the meantime, you're on administrative leave. Badge and department sidearm on the desk." Jake held Pruitt's gaze for 5 full seconds. Everything he wanted to say organized itself into a single clean thought, and he chose not to say any of it. He unclipped his badge and set it on the desk. He set the department sidearm beside it. Then he said, "Rex is my personal partner. He was transferred out of the canine unit into my personal custody 14 months ago. Department records confirm that." Pruitt's expression shifted just slightly. "That's correct." "Then I'll be taking him with me." He walked out. He drove to the homestead. Rex rode in the back seat the way he always did, chin on the headrest near Jake's shoulder. Jake kept both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the road, and didn't say anything for the entire drive, because the thing building in his chest needed to stay controlled until he knew what to do with it. He sat at his father's kitchen table, without the badge for the first time in 4 years. It felt different from what he expected. Lighter in a way that scared him slightly. He had just opened his notebook when headlights swept the window. He checked the clock. 8:47 p.m. He moved to the door, Rex already up and forward. He looked out. A beat-up Subaru with a cracked windshield. Briggs was shorter than Jake expected. 40-ish, glasses, jacket that had seen better winters. He carried a hard drive and a recorder, and the careful energy of a man who had been waiting a long time for the right door to open. "Jake Calloway," he said at the porch steps. "Sam Briggs," Jake said. "Come in." Rex met him at the door. Briggs stopped. Rex sniffed his hand, then walked back to his spot by the table and sat. Jake watched that, and some of the tension in his shoulders eased. They sat across from each other. Jake set the envelope between them. Briggs looked at it. "Can I?" Jake nodded. Briggs opened it slowly. He examined the land grant first, then the map. His expression stayed neutral for about 30 seconds. Then it changed. "The tributary," he said, "runs directly through the eastern quarter," Jake said. "My mother mapped it 3 years ago. She compared the original grant against Harlow's county filings and found the survey data had been altered. The pipeline corridor was designed specifically around falsified markers." Briggs looked up. "Your mother?" "Eleanor Calloway. She died before she could take it anywhere." Briggs set the map down carefully, the way you set down something that has weight beyond its physical size. "I covered the early pipeline story 2 years ago. My editor killed it 3 days before publication. I've never been able to prove why." He looked at Jake. "I think I understand now." Jake said, "Harlow called me this morning." Briggs went very still. "He called you, directly. He tried to settle. Then he told me to be careful. He knows about the documents. He knows something, maybe not everything." Jake looked at the map. "How fast can you move on this?" Briggs pulled the hard drive onto the table. "I have 2 years of background on Harlow's land acquisitions in 3 counties. The pattern is documented. I've been waiting for the evidentiary anchor." He tapped the envelope. "This is the anchor." "I needed to move fast," Jake said. "Pruitt suspended me this morning. Harlow has someone in the department. Once he realizes the documents are out of the house, He'll shift tactics. Briggs nodded. He was already taking photographs of the map with his phone. I can have a draft to my editor in Denver by tomorrow night. She's not connected to Montana politics. That's the whole reason I'm using her. Jake watched him work. Rex watched from the corner. They were 20 minutes into the documentation when Jake's phone buzzed on the table. Martha's number. He picked up. Martha's voice was tight and low. "Jake, your father's gone." Jake stood. "What do you mean, gone?" "He was here an hour ago. I went to check on him, and his room is empty. His coat is gone. I found this on the pillow." She paused. "It's your mother's handwriting. How is that possible?" Jake's stomach dropped. "What does it say?" She read it slowly. "They will lie about the river. The river doesn't lie." Jake grabbed his jacket. "Call me if he contacts you. Don't call anyone else." He hung up. Briggs looked up from the table. "Problem?" "My father checked himself out." Jake was already moving. Rex was already at the door. "He's been gone at least an hour, and he has 2 cracked ribs and a concussion, and he left that note on purpose." It rang 6 times and went to voicemail. He stood on the porch in the cold Montana dark and made himself think. Not feel. Think. Ray knew this land better than any man alive. He knew every road, every trail, every fence line. He knew where Harlow's people operated. He had been listening to 3 months of threats, and he had been planning something long before tonight. Jake looked out at the eastern fence line, at the oak tree standing dark against the sky. Then he looked down at Rex. "Find him," Jake said quietly. Rex lifted his nose into the wind, and then the dog stepped off the porch and moved, not toward the road, not toward town, but down through the lower field, toward the valley, toward the river, toward whatever Ray Calloway had gone to face alone. Rex moved without hesitation, and Jake moved with him, the way they had learned to operate across 4 years of night shifts and search calls, and moments where thinking too much cost you everything. No badge on his chest, no radio at his hip, just the flashlight, the sidearm on his belt, and the dog, reading the dark ahead of him like a language Jake could only partially understand. The lower field was frozen solid. Jake's boots cracked through the thin ice crust with every step. Rex stayed 10 feet ahead, nose working, ears rotating, tail low and focused. Not playing, not exploring, tracking. Behind them, Briggs had stayed at the homestead on Jake's instruction. Document everything. Back it up. Send what you have to your editor tonight, not tomorrow. If Jake wasn't back in 2 hours, call the state police. Not the county, the state. Briggs had looked at him steadily. You're going in without backup. My father is 78 years old, with broken ribs in the middle of a Montana winter, Jake had said. I don't have time to explain the situation to someone who doesn't know the terrain. He was a mile into the lower valley when Rex stopped. The dog stood absolutely still for 3 full seconds, head up, nose testing the air in short, precise pulls. Then he turned left, away from the river, toward the old timber road that ran along the base of the ridge. Jake adjusted without question. He had learned early that arguing with Rex's nose was like arguing with gravity. The timber road led to Harlow's decommissioned grain processing mill, 2 miles further down the valley floor. Jake had driven past it 100 times. Dark for 3 years. Chain-link fence. 3 loading bays facing the road. A basement level that the original property records listed as cold storage. He understood then what his father had done. Ray hadn't wandered out into the night in a moment of confused courage. He had walked out of Martha's house, knowing exactly where he was going and exactly what he was offering. He had left Eleanor's note on the pillow as a signal, not to Jake, but to whoever Harlow had watching the house. Come and get it. Follow me. The 78-year-old man, with cracked ribs, walking alone into the dark, was the most irresistible bait his father could have offered, and Ray Calloway had offered it on purpose. Jake moved faster. Rex held the line straight toward the mill without Jake having to redirect once. A quarter-mile out, the dog slowed and pressed close to Jake's leg. Jake cut the flashlight. He stood in the dark and let his eyes adjust and waited. 3 vehicles at the mill. Morrow's truck, which Jake recognized from the homestead. A black SUV he hadn't seen before. A county sheriff's department cruiser. Pruitt. Jake stood very still and let that land. Not a deputy. Not a patrol unit. Pruitt's personal vehicle. The one with the custom plates that everyone in Coldwater Ridge recognized. The county sheriff was parked at Victor Harlow's private property at 11 o'clock at night, and Ray Calloway was somewhere inside. He circled the fence line slowly with Rex at his heel. The main gate was padlocked. The south side had a section where the chain link had been pulled loose at the base, enough for a man Ray's size to push through if he was willing to get on his hands and knees. Jake went through on his stomach. Rex went through beside him. The loading bay doors were closed. Jake moved along the exterior wall. One window on the basement level had light behind it, thin and yellowish, the kind of light a battery lantern made. He could hear voices. He stopped and listened. Morrow's voice first, flat and impatient. You've got one more chance to tell me where the lawyer is. The one in Billings your kid contacted. I want a name. Silence. Then Ray's voice, and Jake's chest clenched at the sound of it. Strained. Controlled, but strained. I don't know any lawyer in Billings. Your son made 2 calls to a Billings area code in the last 24 hours. We have his phone records. Then ask him. A sound. Something solid hitting something. Jake's jaw locked. Pruitt's voice came then, and hearing it in this context, in this place, at this hour, with his father's voice on the other side of that wall, was the thing that turned Jake's anger into something colder and more useful. Ray, listen to me. I don't want this to go any further than tonight. I've known you for 30 years. Victor is willing to make this go away completely if you give us the documents and the contacts. Everything you've given your son. All of it. Ray said. Dale, how long has he owned you? Silence. How long? Ray said again. His voice wasn't accusatory. It was genuinely asking, the voice of a man trying to understand something that grieved him. Pruitt didn't answer. Morrow said, Last time, old man. The lawyer's name. Jake had already found the side entrance. He looked at Rex. Rex was coiled and waiting, every muscle primed, reading Jake's body the way the dog always did in the moment before everything moved. Jake put his hand on the door handle. He looked at Rex one more time. Ready, he said quietly. Rex's ears went flat and forward. Jake opened the door. The stairwell was dark, and he took it in 4 steps without the flashlight, moving by memory and feel and the sound of voices below. He reached the bottom. A corridor. Light under a door to the left. He flattened against the wall and looked back. Rex was right behind him, silent as shadow. He heard Morrow say, Nash, check the stairwell. Jake had 2 seconds. He pushed the door open. Brock Nash was 3 feet away, turning, and Rex went past Jake like a projectile, covering the distance before Nash cleared his jacket. The dog hit him at the shoulder and drove him into the wall, clamping down on the forearm, and Nash's shout of pain was the loudest thing in the room for about 1 second. Then everything happened at once. Morrow spun and drew, and Jake crossed the room in 3 steps, inside the man's arm before the weapon came level. his left hand driving Morrow's wrist up and outward, the gun clattering somewhere to the right. Morrow was bigger, but Jake was faster and angrier, and he put the man face down on the floor with a controlled weight drop that knocked the air out of him. Tyler Hooks was in the corner, and he ran. He made it to the doorway and hit Brock Nash coming off the wall, and both of them went down in a pile. Rex released Nash's arm on command and stood guard at the doorway, and that was the end of Tyler Hooks' attempt to leave. The room settled into heavy breathing and the sound of Rex's low, steady warning growl. Jake was already across the room. Ray was in a chair, wrists zip-tied to the armrests, a cut above his other eyebrow now, a bruise forming along his left cheekbone. But his eyes were clear and present, and when he saw Jake come through the door, he exhaled a long, slow breath that seemed to release 3 hours of held tension. "Took you long enough," Ray said. "You could have told me the plan," Jake said, pulling the zip ties. His hands were shaking slightly. He didn't try to hide it. "You would have stopped me." "Yes," Jake said. "I would have." Ray flexed his wrists. He looked at Rex, who had come over and pressed his head firmly against Ray's knee. Ray put his hand on the dog and closed his eyes for just a moment. "Good boy," he said quietly. Jake turned. Pruitt was standing against the far wall, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had already understood that the road he'd been walking had ended. He wasn't reaching for anything. He wasn't threatening anything. He just stood there looking at Ray Calloway in the chair, at the cuts and bruises on an old man's face, and something in his own face had gone slack and wrong. "Dale," Ray said without looking up, "how many years we known each other?" Pruitt's voice came out rough. 32 years. That's a long time to sell someone out." Pruitt didn't answer. Jake found Morrow's phone on the floor near the overturned chair. He picked it up. The screen was still lit. A call log opened to the top. Victor Harlow's name at the top of the list, with a call timestamp from 47 minutes ago. The call was marked as ended. Jake looked at it. Then he looked more carefully. The call had ended, but below it, partially visible under Morrow's recent calls list, was something Jake hadn't expected. A folder, labeled with a date from 8 months ago, and inside it, voice memos. 11 of them, all time-stamped, all with the same incoming caller label. Harlow V. Jake opened the first one. Harlow's voice came through the speaker clearly, unhurried, giving Morrow specific instructions about the Ed Briggs property. Jake listened for 4 seconds and stopped it. He looked at Ray. "Dad, Morrow has been recording Harlow." Ray looked up. 8 months of calls, all of them on here. Jake held up the phone. Morrow was building insurance, in case Harlow ever decided to cut him loose. Ray stared at him. He recorded his own boss? Every conversation, including Pruitt. Jake scrolled. At least 3 calls where Harlow discusses the payments to the sheriff's department directly. He looked at Pruitt, by name. Pruitt closed his eyes. Jake stepped to the doorway. The blizzard outside was still moving. He pressed the call button on the state police non-emergency line, the number he had memorized 3 days ago when he had first understood that Pruitt couldn't be trusted. He had never hoped not to need it. He had always known he would. The dispatcher picked up. "This is former Officer Jake Calloway, Glacier County Sheriff's Department. I'm at the Harlow Mill on Route 9, 2 miles south of Coldwater Ridge. I have 3 individuals detained, one of whom is County Sheriff Dale Pruitt. I have a victim requiring medical attention, and I have recorded evidence of federal extortion and criminal conspiracy. I need state units, and I need them now." He gave the address. The dispatcher confirmed. He hung up. Then he looked at the phone in his hand again. The call log. Harlow's name at the top. The call that had ended 47 minutes ago. Jake pressed it. It rang 3 times. Harlow answered. "Dean, tell me you have it." Jake let the silence sit for exactly 2 seconds. "Mr. Harlow, this is Jake Calloway." A sharp intake of breath on the line. "I want you to know 3 things," Jake said. "My father is alive and going home tonight. Sam Briggs has the documents, and his editor has had them since 9 p.m. And the phone I'm calling you from has 8 months of your recorded voice on it." He paused. "Your attorney is going to tell you to run. I'd suggest you listen to that particular piece of advice while you still can." The line went dead. Jake stood in the silence. Rex padded over and sat beside him, leaning against his leg. Jake reached down and ran his hand along the dog's back. From outside, over the wind, he heard it. The distant, layered sound of sirens. Multiple units moving fast up the valley road from the south. State police, not county. Briggs had been listening through the phone the entire time. Jake had called him at the same moment he'd called the state line. Left the call open in his jacket pocket. When Jake's voice came through, clearly confirming 3 detainees and Pruitt's name, Briggs had already called his contact at the State Bureau. The recording was already uploading to a secure server in Denver. Ray stood slowly, one hand on the chair back, ribs pulling with every breath. He looked at his son. He looked at Rex. He looked at the 3 men on the floor, and the sheriff against the wall, and the phone in Jake's hand. "Your mother," Ray said slowly, "she used to say you were the one who would bring the light back." Jake's throat tightened. He looked at his father, at every bruise and cut and year written on that face. "I just did what you taught me," he said. "Stand your ground." Ray reached out. He took Jake's face in both scarred hands, the same way he had in the kitchen the night this began, the same gesture that meant more than any words either of them knew how to say. Rex pressed against Ray's leg and stayed there. Outside, the 1st State Police Unit hit the chain-link gate with its lights going, and Coldwater Ridge was never going to be the same. Victor Harlow was stopped at the county line at 12:14 a.m. by 2 state police units that had been waiting there since Briggs made his call. His attorney was in the passenger seat, which told the state investigators everything they needed to know about how long Harlow had been planning to run. He didn't say a word at the arrest. He just looked straight ahead while the cuffs went on. The way men look when they've spent years believing they were untouchable, and the moment of understanding has finally arrived. Jake heard about it from the state sergeant at the mill, while the paramedics were checking Ray's ribs for the 2nd time in 4 days. The sergeant, a tall woman named Ortega, who had driven 2 hours from Great Falls and arrived looking like she'd been waiting for exactly this kind of call, handed Jake a printed sheet with Harlow's booking information and said, "Your father okay?" Jake looked at Ray, who was arguing with a paramedic about whether he needed to go back to the hospital. "He'll outlive us all," Jake said. Ray lost the argument about the hospital. He went, but only after making Jake promise that Rex would be at the homestead when he came home. Jake promised. He drove back to the ridge with Rex in the back seat and sat in the dark kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights, and Rex sat beside him on the floor with his head in Jake's lap, and neither of them needed anything more than that for a while. Briggs published the 1st installment of his 3-part series 4 days later. He titled it, "The River Doesn't Lie." The opening paragraph described Eleanor Calloway's handwriting on a piece of yellowed paper sealed under a floorboard for 3 years. And by the time that paragraph finished, the story had already been picked up by 2 national wire services. Jake read it at the kitchen table with his coffee. When he reached the paragraph about his mother, he set the mug down and looked out the window at the oak tree for a long time without reading further. Then he picked the mug back up and kept going. The Federal Environmental Agency, opened a formal investigation into Harlow's pipeline permits within 6 days of the article going live. The altered survey data was confirmed by an independent contractor within 2 weeks. The pipeline contract, worth $340 million in federal infrastructure money, was frozen pending a full audit. 3 other families in 2 counties who had signed land contracts under Harlow's pressure had their agreements voided by court order. 2 of them called Jake personally. He didn't know what to say, so he just listened. And that turned out to be the right thing. Dale Pruitt resigned on a Tuesday morning and said nothing public. Angela Flores was named acting sheriff the same afternoon. She called Jake before the press release went out. "I kept records," she told him. "Every time Pruitt buried a report or redirected the case, I logged it. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it." "Then you started filing those follow-ups, and I understood." Jake said, "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" A pause. "Because I wasn't sure you'd survive long enough for it to matter." She said it without apology. "I needed to know you were going to see it through." "And now?" "Now I'm the sheriff," she said, "and I'd like to offer you your badge back." Jake looked at Rex, who was watching him from across the room, with the particular stillness he used when he understood that something important was being decided. "I'll think about it," Jake said. He thought about it for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Ray came home from his cousin's house. He walked through the front door and stood in the kitchen and looked around at everything Morrow's men had touched, and everything Jake had quietly put back in the days since. And he was quiet for a long time. Then he crossed to the window and looked out at the oak tree. "You know what your mother used to say about this place?" Ray said. It wasn't really a question. Jake leaned against the counter. "Tell me." "She used to say, the land doesn't belong to us. We belong to it. She said every generation has to decide if they're worth what was given to them." Ray turned from the window. His face was healing slowly, the bruising fading to yellow at the edges, the cut above his eye closed to a thin line. He looked at Jake steadily. "You were worth it, son." Jake's throat closed. He looked at the floor for a moment and then back at his father. "I almost didn't get there in time." "But you did." "It was Rex who found the trail." Ray looked at the dog. Rex's tail moved once, twice, deliberate and calm. Ray walked over and crouched down carefully, ribs pulling, and put both hands on the dog's face. Rex held still and let him. "I know," Ray said quietly. "I know it was." He stood back up. He looked at Jake. "What are you going to do about the badge?" "Flores wants me back." "What do you want?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "I want to stay close to home for a while. I want to be here when they break ground on the rebuild." He paused. "I was thinking about the canine program. Flores mentioned it. Regional training facility, search and rescue. Officers from across the state bring their dogs. We'd run the operation out of the East Field." Ray looked at him for a long time. Something moved behind the old man's eyes that Jake couldn't fully read. Something layered and deep. The expression of a man hearing something that rhymes with a prayer he made a long time ago. "Your mother wanted to turn the East Field into something useful," Ray said. "She always thought the land ought to serve more people than just us." Jake looked at him. "I know." Ray nodded once. "Then do it." The formal charges against Victor Harlow were filed 8 weeks after the night at the mill. Extortion, wire fraud, federal environmental permit violations, conspiracy to commit assault. His attorneys entered a not guilty plea, but the recorded calls on Morrow's phone left very little room for a trial strategy built on denial. Dean Morrow negotiated a plea agreement within 6 weeks and testified against Harlow in exchange for a reduced sentence. Tyler Hooks and Brock Nash both took deals. Harlow's trial date was set for the following spring. Briggs won a state press award for the series. He drove back up to Coldwater Ridge to tell Ray in person, which Jake thought was the right instinct. Ray shook his hand and told him Eleanor would have appreciated the work. Briggs looked away and cleared his throat, and then asked if there was any of that coffee left. The state officially registered the Callaway homestead as a historical landmark 6 weeks after the federal investigation opened. The sign at the gate was replaced with one that read, Callaway Homestead, established 1897, protected in perpetuity. Jake stood at the gate and looked at it for a long time on the morning it went up. Rex sat beside him and did the same. The canine training facility broke ground in early spring. Flores signed the operational permit herself. The sign Jake had made for the gate read simply, "Trust is forged here." Rex ran the first demonstration drill on a cold Tuesday morning with 2 young shepherds, Kaiser and Lena, working a scent track Jake had laid at dawn. Officers from 3 counties watched from the fence line. One of them, a young deputy from Missoula who couldn't have been more than 23, said to Jake afterward, "How do you get a dog to track like that in blizzard conditions?" Jake looked at Rex, who was drinking from a bowl near the gate with complete indifference to the question. "You don't get him to," Jake said. "You build enough trust that he wants to." That morning, Jake and Ray sat on the porch together before the day's work began. Ray had his coffee. Jake had his. Rex was already in the lower field, moving the way he always did when the morning was cold and the world felt clean. The kind of movement that was less patrolling and more celebrating. Ray watched him and shook his head slowly, the way a man does when something delights him beyond words. "You know what the difference is," Ray said, "between a soldier and a veteran?" Jake shook his head. "A soldier fights the war he's sent to," Ray said. "A veteran fights to make sure the next one doesn't have to." Jake looked at his father, at the healed cut above his eye and the silver in his hair and the scarred hands wrapped around the mug. At the man who had stood at a door against 3 armed men and refused to move because his wife was buried at the eastern fence and his family's name was on a piece of paper sealed under the floor. "I don't think there's going to be a next one," Jake said. "Not here." Ray nodded slowly. "No," he said. "I don't think there is." Rex barked from the lower field, sharp, satisfied. The sound carried across the valley the way only good things carry, clean and far and without echo. Jake laughed. It was the laugh of a man who had been holding his breath for weeks and finally let it go. Ray smiled beside him, the deep-lined smile of a man who had lived long enough to see something rare, a wrong made right, a family still standing, a piece of land still keeping its promise. The oak tree at the eastern fence stood the same as it always had. The river ran clean through the eastern quarter. The valley below Coldwater Ridge was still. The Callaway homestead had weathered every storm that had ever come for it. And now, the morning belonged to them completely, and no one was ever going to take it away again. Some men fight for titles, and some fight for money, and some fight because they've forgotten why they started. Raymond Callaway fought for a grave under an oak tree and the handwriting of a woman who loved him, and his son fought because his father taught him that the most important ground you'll ever defend is the ground beneath your own feet. They didn't just keep the land. They kept everything the land stood for. The loyalty, the memory, the stubborn, unbreakable faith that what is right is worth every cost it demands. And in the end, that is the only victory that ever truly lasts. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that standing your ground still means something. Leave a comment below and tell us what you are holding on to. And if you believe that courage and faith can still change the world, write Amen below. God bless you, protect your home, and fill your heart with the same peace that finally came to the Callaways on that Montana morning, when the fight was done and the light came back. Subscribe and stay with us for more stories that remind us what we are all still capable of.